loneliness and, of course, abuse, because physically, emotionally, spiritually, we were 100% abused in that area. Sexually, I wouldn't want to put a number on it. It was fairly high. So
first of all, it's always very emotional. It is, and it's very reflective. I'm not a residential school survivor, but I do know many people who were. And growing up in that environment, it really starts to make sense. Many of the social issues and the challenges that many Indigenous people face, and how residential schools are tied to a whole bigger set of policies that were meant to colonize and gain control of the land and resources.
In between the 17th to the 20th century, the Canadian government had been providing Indigenous children with religious-operated mission schools that would later turn into residential schools. In between 1701 and 1921, the Canadian government and the Indigenous peoples signed over 70 historical treaties. When the numbered treaties were signed, the Indigenous people wanted education added to their treaty, so that the coming generations would change with the changing social society outside their lands. They didn't, however, specify how their children would receive that education, and I think if they had, they wouldn't have been put through the trauma of residential schools.
Not in the format that it was. I think the people that were negotiating that in the treaty saw it as an opportunity to gather knowledge that would help them to participate in society. Definitely, I don't think they envisioned what was going to be happening in the residential schools the way that it did. When you put your mind around it and you start to realize, wow, that's pretty forward thinking. If I'm signing a treaty at the time, I'm not thinking about myself. I'm wanting education for my children and my grandchildren and my children's children's children and so forth, so on. It speaks very well to the wisdom of the people that were signing the treaties at the time.
I don't think they had a clue. Even though treaties were signed, there was a lot of promises, a lot of bickering back and forth, and it seemed to be understood that things were going to be.
Take the Indian out of the child. The growing Indian threat, aggressive assimilation, cultural genocide.
I would hope that it would be a start, and I think it has been a start, especially on the world stage and other countries looking at this. The United Nations and other people have mentioned this, and for as long as I've been, we have to keep our fingers crossed that many positive things are going to come out of this. Those young people didn't give their lives for nothing.
Well, residential schools, my way of thinking is to open them up. They talked about, like Ryan said, taking the Indian out of the child. Now, and they took that to heart. The abuse that went on to take that Indian out of the child was horrific. In a lot of cases, there's death involved, runaways, and like I said, a lot of abuses. And if anything, more so, like I said, is being away from family. It's horrific.
In the early 17th century, the assimilation effect started with French missionaries. The Indigenous peoples resisted what the French were trying to do to their children and hated leaving them for long periods of time. The French would introduce day schools and boarding schools by groups called the Roquettes, the Jesuits, and the Ursulines. They would be abandoned by the 1630s.
As time went on, when the students would leave the residential schools when they were complete, a lot of them went back to their own way of life. And so as time went on, I think a lot of people actually picked up on that, which is not, I'm saying it's not great, but it taught you how to live out in society afterwards, and to talk their language, because definitely you needed that.
The thought of religious education efforts would not be thought of until the 1820s, specifically by an Anglican missionary by the name of John West. Persistent missionaries like John West would open residential schools all over Ontario. To this day, the Mohawk Institute that was opened in 1834, and one of the first, Brantfort, Ontario, would be the longest running residential school in Canada.
I think it's going to take a long time. It's only come to light in this generation for the non-Indigenous population, the effects of residential schools. The solutions and the cures are not going to come overnight by any means. It's a long process. We didn't get here overnight. It was, in this part of the country, it was 150 years of residential schools. To reconcile that, with the Reconciliation Commission is about, to reconcile that is going to take many generations.
And because of the so-called success of the Brantfort Residential School, there would still be an interest in residential schools in the 1800s because of the decline of the military hospitals after the war in 1812. Even though the American invasion effort was minimized and they had the assistance of the Indigenous peoples, the settlers went back to thinking the Indigenous peoples were the Indian threat. Some of you might be thinking, This is good, right? The kids got an education, they learned how to read and write, right? Wrong. The children at these schools were not only taken from their homes, communities, and families, they weren't allowed to practice their traditions or speak their own language. Many of them were now malnourished and abused. All the children that were taken to residential schools had hoped nothing would change. But they were wrong, very wrong. They changed everything about the children. Their hair was cut short, they were made to wear uniforms, they were given numbers, and their days were under strict timetables. The boys and girls were kept separate. It didn't matter if you were siblings or not.
When you walk into the residential school area, they stripped you down, they give you a haircut, and they put different clothes, a uniform thing on it with a number on there which you were known by. And to this day, I still remember my number is 657. And that was sewn in every piece of your clothing, your caps, your gloves. So that's how they were wanting to put their way of thinking, their religion, their culture into the students. And then at the same time, take their beliefs, their culture, their language away, so that when they talk about residential school, then they would be, except for the blood, they said, but where they had the color, but they figured they would be, same as the settlers were and have the same mindset. So that's in a lot of ways there too. They banned the cultural activities in our communities and our languages. Of course, we couldn't use our language in the residential schools. So there again, you're punished.
And to top all of these things off, some of the children never even made it home to their families. Let me tell you this, 4,118 children died while at residential schools. And the sad thing is, that's not the full number, because the priests in the Catholic Church didn't care. And that's the truth. In 2021, thanks to modern technology, they were able to use survey equipment to track down just how many children were put in unmarked graves.
The initial response, an immense sadness for all of the families and the healing that's going to have to come from this. And that took a while to deal with, and that doesn't go away very quickly. At some point, I really did come to a point where there's something good that comes out of everything, and that was, if I think of it as a crack in the door, and it had to do with one of the posters that I had seen where the children were being freed from the ground, and light was entering the room, and to me, that was the crack in the door of the door opening just the slightest little sliver where the rest of Canada, the entire world couldn't say this didn't happen anymore. The reality was there. Some of my next thoughts were, that's one school. Now how many residential schools are there? Something that's happened since then or that hasn't happened since then is that people's awareness was peaked for a while, but it seems to have slowed down, and maybe that's the media because the number is over 7,000 now. And that number should send a very serious, strong message to everybody in the world that, whoa, this really happened, did it? This is probably one of the worst disasters in the world's history.
Yeah, it was kind of a bittersweet day because that was May 31st, 2020, when it was brought out in the news. And that happened to be the birthday of my deceased daughter, who I had lost 6 months prior to that. For people to finally hear and see what actually happened, like when the discovery of Ulrich bodies, I think brought to light, that the residential school system did in fact exist, because it opened a lot of eyes for the naysayers, for the people who didn't think all this abuse went on into the residential school systems and nuns and priests wouldn't kill people, or kids especially. So I think when those bodies were recovered, it was a real eye-opener for Canada and the world. And as time goes on, there's more and more discoveries that, that's going on. So, and not only that, but it brought a lot of peace, I guess, to the families of these young people that were found. So it brings some closure to their lives, and because a lot of them didn't know where their children were. Yeah, so it was huge. It was huge. It still is.
I knew some of the stories that were happening on reserves and at residential schools because I have family members who have sexually abused children in the residential schools, Long Gordons, and got away with it. When they finally are found children, it was shock and some relief for these kids because it's like they finally have been found. They are finally getting recognized and buried the proper way. Having a plaque or even just something to recognize that all these kids were lost and they didn't have a voice, and now they do. I'm proud to be who I am as an Aboriginal woman, and every year I wear my orange shirt in pride. I wear my beaded earrings, I wear my beaded stuff in pride.
And that's not even the half of it. Because of the schools being so underfunded, the buildings of the schools were in dangerously poor quality. There were reports of fires ripping through the schools, only to be rebuilt later. Many of the schools lived in tents for shelter before they decided to build them out of brick. I can't even begin to think of having to go through what those children had to. Am I happy that I didn't have to go through it? Yes. But am I happy my family is part of this dark piece of history? No.
Student survivor, I didn't feel, in any way think that I was one of them because of my background, where my family, my parents who were also residential school survivors. My dad was a hardworking man, worked on a railroad, and because there was no work in our communities, you had to go out and work to survive.
Most of the stuff, besides from our grandfather and our great uncle and our great aunts, is the horrors that place did to children. I am Serena Stedman. I'm 22. I'm from Regina, Saskatchewan, and I'm Canadian. I was shocked when I saw that Gordon's was the last school to be opened in, I believe it was 1996 that it closed. I never realized until later that old gym was part of a residential school, that on those grounds, that was where they took children first. About residential schools briefly, and quite frankly censored version of residential schools in elementary. Didn't really think very much of it. I knew it was a school, I knew it was for Indigenous children, I didn't think anything of it. But I was a child then, and we had been taught so many different things about my own culture that I knew already. I was angry because my grandfather, this amazing man who has done amazing things with his entire life, had to be subject to being ripped away from his family, to be told not to speak Cree, to change every aspect that made him Indigenous and throw it away, to give a new slate, a new name, a new outlook and religion. You never anticipate how much trauma your family actually goes through or is hiding when you look at history. To think this all started because the Plains Cree wanted education for their coming generations so that they could thrive in a new society, to be self-efficient. All the government wanted to do was to assimilate them. It's not even me that have thoughts on this either. There are other members of my family that have thoughts on this as well.
My father, Arthur Anderson, he went to residential school, and so did his brother Wilfred Anderson. These are my grandparents, Walter Anderson and Jenny Anderson, and my cookum, Flora, and she was a medicine woman on Gordon's Reserve. Kansai. My name's Elizabeth Stedman. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. I'm 48 years old. I'm Aboriginal Canadian. Extremely painful. I didn't like what my dad had to go through, and my uncle, and all the rest of the people that did go through this, and what the ministers and the priests and the nuns and what they did to these children. My father became a person to try and bridge the gap between Native people and white people. Because he went to residential school and experienced what he experienced, he became a better person and a better father. Teach my brother and I what happened and trying to teach us to forgive. That was a big thing with my dad in his residential school experience, and is to forgive those people who did those horrors.
And I always wondered what the point of view of someone who isn't Indigenous and has never heard of residential schools.
The only thing I can recall is hearing the name residential school, but had no context or what that actually meant or anything like that. Really had no idea. My name is Dave Stedman. I am 55 years old, and I was born in Regina. I'm Canadian. Really, the first I'd ever really heard of residential schools was when I was in university, reading the story of one of the young people that had tried to walk home. That really hit hard, of how, maybe just a tip of the iceberg of how tragic this may have been, and what this all involved. And so nothing growing up I really didn't find out anything until really I got to the university level, and that opened my eyes, and then I did a lot more research after that. It's certainly different when human beings are involved and real people are involved that you are meeting, that you're having interaction with. It certainly changes it a lot. It puts a face to it, put it that way. Yeah.
I, for one, know that this piece of history is always going to be there. What happened, and thank goodness it ended. In 1996, Putney, Saskatchewan was the last residential schools to close its doors, closing it so that no other child that is Indigenous will have to go through that kind of pain again. also to be educated by it as well. On my reserve, we have an old gym that was part of the residential school. And instead of remembering this building as a part of a dark piece of history that inflicted so much pain and suffering, we used that building for celebrations and gatherings. We even set up photos of our ancestors on one of the walls to help us remember who we are and where we come from. And ever since then, the Canadian government has apologized for what happened so long ago to our daughters, to our sons, uncles, aunties, grandmothers, and grandfathers. But the question is it enough? We're living in 2022, and is an apology enough for decades of suffering and pain? I hope so, for my sake and theirs.